Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I have in front of me Alien Legion Volume 1. And if you don't know what Alien Legion is, you're in for a treat. Alien Legion was a comic put out by Marvel, but it was put out by an imprint of Marvel called Epic Comics, which was around in the 80s and the 90s. And to explain Alien Legion, I have to explain a little bit about Epic Comics, because Epic Comics and its format really influenced what Alien Legion was. Epic Comics was an imprint of Marvel. It was where Marvel did things that were basically non-superhero comics. They did have some superhero comics there, but most of them were non-superhero comics. Basically, Marvel knew which side of its bread was buttered. It knew that it was a superhero comic publisher. It knew that superhero comics were where they got their money from. But they decided to branch out a little bit, and they branched out into Epic Comics. Now, a lot of people would see Epic Comics as Marvel's version of Vertigo, but it's much more than that, because Vertigo focused almost entirely on mystical storylines, whereas in Epic Comics, they did a lot of different kinds of things, Just to give you a couple of examples, there were some superhero things done in there. These are the first books that published Mobius's work. Again, before he was Mobius, because the first books that he published were with Epic Comics called Mobius. But he also published through them his 2-issue miniseries of The Silver Surfer, which I'll probably be going over at some point. There was also things like John Byrne's The Last Galactus story. Now, right here I have to say, I'm not entirely sure whether or not these types of stories, Mobius's Silver Surfer and John Byrne's Galactus story, are actually continuity within the main Marvel universe. They may be, they may not be. I've never run across anything to tell me yes or no. If anybody knows whether they are or are not, let me know below in the comments. But getting back to Epic Comics, they didn't do a lot of superhero comics. They did a lot of other different things. There were things like the fantasy story of ElfQuest, which was sort of cartoonish, but it was in a fantasy world, and it followed a party of elves. And there was also things like Gru, which again was in a fantasy world. It was very, very cartoonish, and it was basically a cartoon take upon Conan the Barbarian. They had books like Video Jack, which had a British comic feel. There were a lot of historical fiction books, some of them written by Chris Claremont. Chris Claremont wrote The Black Dragon. He also wrote Miranda, the She-Wolf. You have also other kinds of superhero books like the ultra-violent, ultra-anti-hero story of martial law. Now, when we talk about martial law, that goes right into something else about Epic Comics. Epic Comics did not follow the comic code. It was Marvel's place where they put books which didn't have to follow the comic code. But that being said, with Alien Legion was a book that looked like it followed the comic code. There was nothing in it that would suggest that they didn't follow the comic code, even to the point where there's really no cursing in it. You can see them avoiding putting cursing in it, or where normally in a normal comic book you would see where they curse a string of nonsensical images. They did in Alien Legion the Battlestar Galactica thing where they made up a word and that would be their curse word. So again, even though Epic Comics didn't follow the comic code, Alien Legion seemed like it was a comic that did follow the comic code. But the reason why I wanted to go over Epic Comics and what they did for Marvel was because of the fact that it seemed that Epic Comics was where Marvel published stories that would probably be better published in other formats besides a comic book. You had comic book stories, again, like the Silver Surfer stories and the Last Galactus story. There was also things like Dreadstar. They were very well suited to being comic book stories. But again, ElfQuest and Gru, they could have been done much better, I think, as a cartoon. You had The Black Dragon and the other Chris Claremont stories, which would probably be better in novel form. And you had Alien Legion. And Alien Legion, in its format, looks like a movie, looks like a television show. It doesn't look a lot of the time like it's built for a comic book. It looks like it's built for the screen. It uses not so much tropes, but visual things that you would see in movies and see in television. things like how you would hack into a computer. There's a visual of that you would normally see in a movie or a television show. You would have panels that would show that. Here in Alien Legion, you also had sort of the way that explosives were used, the way that a grenade would fall. It would look like something you would see in Die Hard. You also had, in the very first volume, because this is only volume 1 that I'm going to go over today, I'll probably go over volume 2 some other time, you had a Star Wars aesthetic for the look of the book. It starts out, and you can see that it's very Star Wars-ish, just the way that it looks. And the Alien Legion looks like a band of Stormtroopers. That's what you're following. You're following a band of Stormtroopers. And this was long before anything like that ever came out of the Star Wars universe. At the time that these were published in 1984 through 1987, all there was for the Star Wars universe was the movies and a couple of comic books. That was it. And it never focused on anything like this. Never focused on anything like following Stormtroopers. But this is what this book looks and feels like. You're following a group of Stormtroopers. That's what the Alien Legion is. And in book 3, it looks like you're on Mos Eisley. That's what the look and feel of these books are. And it serves them very well. They do it very well in putting that visual onto the page. But it would probably work better as a movie or a television show. And the great thing about that is that if you look on IMDb right now, you will see that Alien Legion is supposed to become a movie sometime in the near future. So you may be looking this book up anyways when this movie comes out. Now, again, I don't know if this movie that's supposed to come out is going to be part of the Marvel Universe or not. It may be the next big Marvel space movie. It may be its own independent space movie. I'm not entirely sure. Either way, I think it's going to be great once they actually put it on the screen, because if it's part of the Marvel Universe, it's going to fit in well with what they already have going for their space set movies. But if they put it in its own universe, it's going to be something that Star Wars fans will most probably love to see, just because it'll get back to the original Star Wars kind of feel for a movie. But to get back to the comic, there's one other thing about Epic Comics which set it apart from other comics. It had a format. It had a superior quality format. And its pages were much thicker than a normal comic book page. You got more pages per comic. And of those pages that you got, none of them were ads. The only ad that you would find in the entire book would be on the back cover page, and that would be an advertisement for another Epic comic. The whole thing was story. And that's great for anybody who wants to read this story, because you really get your bang for your buck with this story. Even now, if you go and look online, if you go to your local store and you can find this, you're only going to pay about $3 or $4 per issue. And of volume 1, there's only 21 issues. There is an omnibus. There's actually a couple of omnibus put out there. One was done by Checker Books, and it came out somewhere around 2001, 2005. And there was also one put out by Dark Horse Comics, which was supposed to reboot the franchise, but that never happened. So you can find these stories in a collection, but you're not going to be paying much more for the actual comic books, if you can find them, than you would be paying for the omnibus. So having said that, I'm going to treat this great run of Alien Legion as the entire volume 1, which is only 21 issues. 21 issues seems like a really large run, but it really doesn't need to be chopped into more than one great run. It's a great run in itself, and as I said, you can pick these up fairly cheaply, either at your comic book store if you could find the originals, which would be great to add to your collection, or if you could find the omnibus. But since I'm going to go over the entire volume as a great run, I'm not going to go over individual books, and I'm not going to go over individual storylines, because there's a number of storylines and they're all good. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the world and characters of this book and give you a feel for this besides what I've already done. And hopefully it will get you into wanting to read Alien Legion. Now, first off, for the feel of these books, again, I already talked about the fact that it sort of feels like you're following a band of Stormtroopers. It really does. But if you want a different kind of description of it, think of G.I. Joe in space. That's what this would be. I was originally going to say, think of GI Combat in space. If anybody remembers GI Combat, it was a book that came out in the, I think, 50s and 60s, which was basically World War II stories. And Alien Legion feels a lot like GI Combat in space, but I would say GI Joe in space a little more, because sometimes the Alien Legion acts as a military unit. Sometimes it acts as an investigation unit. Not too often, but sometimes it does. So it has a little more than just military-based stories in it. So if any of you like G.I. Joe and you like fantasy stories, G.I. Joe in space, that's what Alien Legion is. So to move on to what the Alien Legion universe looks like, it has, again, I keep on going back to references to other things, but you have to remember that I'm referencing these things long before they actually happened, because Alien Legion was a precursor to all of these things. So the universe that Alien Legion is in looks a lot like the Trade Federation in the prequels for Star Wars. You have two different galaxies who discovered each other and started a Trade Federation. And basically they took over their respective galaxies, and then they discovered another galaxy which they brought into their Trade Federation. So you have this Trade Federation, and each of these galaxies is controlled by one of the arms of this Trade Federation. So again, it does feel very Star Wars-ish, but this story was originally written in the late 70s. Volume 1 came out between 1984 and 1987, so it was before any of these things ever came to the screen, either for Star Wars in the prequels or for their television shows or anything like that. And very quickly, I want to say that Volume 1 has a very Star Wars feel. Volume 2 has a very Star Trek feel. But I won't get into Volume 2 today. I'm only going to talk about Volume 1. So in this universe where they have this 3-galaxy Trade Federation, the 3-galaxy Trade Federation controls everything. They are basically the government. And they're not exactly the most benevolent government that there is. In these galaxies, there's things like slavery, and no one seems to bat an eye at it. And so you have a lot of people who don't exactly like this situation. So the Trade Federation needs a military in order to keep control, and that military is the Alien Legion. And the Alien Legion does things like quash rebellions. There is a storyline where this world doesn't want to be part of the Trade Federation, because if they are, their people are going to be drafted into the military, and they're a world of pacifists. But the Alien Legion comes in and just destroys the rebellion, because that's what the military does for this storyline. So again, you can see very clearly that there's kind of parallels to Star Wars with the Empire and the Trade Federation and the Stormtroopers. So to move on from the military to the squad that you follow in these books, the squad that you follow in these books is called Squad Nomad. And Squad Nomad ends up being the place where the military shoves the worst of the worst. The people that they don't really want in their military, but they'll take them anyways. Thieves and cowards and things like that. That's what it ends up becoming. They call themselves the worst of the worst. But that's not how it begins in Volume 1. So to give you a little view of what the Alien Legion is actually structured like, it's supposed to be the French Foreign Legion in space. That's basically what it is. And if you don't know what the French Foreign Legion is, it's just a part of the French army where foreigners can actually serve in the French army. So you have a lot of different kinds of people in the French Foreign Legion. And in the Alien Legion, you have a whole bunch of different kinds of races. That's what the Alien Legion is made up of. So I'm going to go over basically the core members of Squad Nomad. And I know I'm going to pronounce their names wrong. I don't know if there's actually a way to pronounce their names. They haven't really come up with that yet, I suppose, until they get the movie going. First of all, you have the captain, which is Captain Sarah Gar. So this squad, it looks like a Dungeons & Dragons party. It kind of does. Besides all the other descriptions I've given of it, it kind of looks like somebody put it together with a second edition D&D monster manual, trying to figure out what their party looks like. So I'm going to give you a lot of references here. So Captain Sarah Gar, he looks like a cross between a dark elf and a Yuan-Ti. His top half looks like a dark elf, and he has a snake tail. His entire bottom half is a snake tail. And it's a really, really good aesthetic for a character. He is very much in the vein of Wolverine in that way. So he is the military man. He runs the squad. He has an impeccable record. He is very dedicated to the Legion Code of Honor, even so much as he will get himself into trouble to protect that code over and above following orders sometimes, which happens in the first couple of issues. Then you have his second in command, who is Lieutenant Montarock, who is a humanoid. He's a well-educated rich kid, and his father stuck him in the military basically to make a man out of him. Then you have Z-Rod, who basically is a kobold. He was an ex-general of Union Regulars, and the Union Regulars were basically a regional planetary force, and he resigned his commission in that so that he could just be a soldier again. You have Miko, who reminds me a lot of a Mind Flayer. He has this pinkish skin. He doesn't have the tentacles coming out of his face, but he's the medic of the group, and he is a low-level Esper. You have Dunn, which is another humanoid, and he is basically a human fighter. He is a little bit an engineer in this as well, but he reminds me of someone trying to take Sergeant Rock and put him into space. He's a little less moral than Sergeant Rock, but he looks like Sergeant Rock. You have Grimrod, who looks kind of like a half-elf. He's the smuggler, gambler, thief of the party. You have Dirge, who looks like an Umbra Hulk. They call him the Tank, and he basically is the one that goes in and takes all the hits. You have Meskad, who is a half-ogre, and you have Tamara, who looks like a half-elf, and she is basically not Lady J, but the Scarlet from G.I. Joe. She is Scarlet of this company. She's acrobatic, and she's the new person in the group. She doesn't actually come into the stories until about halfway through the series. I think she's the only woman in the squad. I'm not entirely sure if she's the only female in the squad because, of course, you're dealing with aliens, so there's all that. All right, so those are your basic members of Squad Nomad, but you have a bunch of other characters as well, which are characters that die, characters that, are just grunt soldiers that come in and out. And you follow this party of soldiers through their, well, not so much adventures, but through their orders of what they're given. Now, to get a little bit into the story here, just very, very lightly into the story, it's well told. The story is done very, very well. Just because it starts off, and at the first they have usually a main story and then a smaller story at the back. And each of these stories will focus on one of these characters, give you their background and why they're in the Legion, all these kinds of things. And it will give you that story about that person in relation to them fulfilling a mission. They have a mission every issue. And for the first couple of issues, it just seems like they're throwaway missions. They're not really anything that connect together right away. But as you get into about issue 3, you realize that there is a part of this mission that is connected to a larger story. And that's the way this story is told, and that's the way good comic stories are told. Today, if you can find a comic story which is not trying to push its politics down your throat and it's just a comic story, it's either one of two kinds of stories. It's either a throwaway story or it's something that's supposed to be epic. It starts too large. It starts, the characters are facing the end of the world. And when you start there, where do you go from there? Because if it's a throwaway story, nobody's going to be interested. And if it's a story that starts with epic and you can't go farther up than epic, then people are going to get bored with it. Good stories, good comic stories begin and continue in the way that Alien Legion continues. You have a smaller story that's connected somehow, sometimes only in very, very small ways, to a larger story. And then it builds up that larger story. Because comics are episodic. It's like a television show. Again, this is very much like a television show. You have your individual episodes, and it focuses on its own story and beginning to end, and you can just focus on that. But if you continue on to the next issue, you will see that there's a thread that connects all of the issues together. And your main story is your end of the season. And I think that this story was written, again, only to have this type of story to be told because they had an end of the season. They had a story arc which they were following and they knew where they were going with it. And it works well. And that's what makes this a really good comic run, is the story. It has really good art. There's a lot of different kinds of artists in this. And again, it looks a lot like your old-time war comics. Even though it's dealing with aliens, there's a lot of detail that you would find sort of in a war comic. And like I said, there's a lot of different artists, but then they eventually settle on Larry Strongman as their artist near the end. And I love the art of Larry Strongman. He has great runs in this at the end of Volume 1 and again in Volume 2. So, yeah, again, it's a great story, and if you're looking for something with a good story, go and find Alien Legion. It's a good story for people who like G.I. Joe. It's a good story for people who like early Star Wars kinds of stories. If you're following a band of Stormtroopers around, it's a good story for people who like just generic adventure stories, like a D&D story, but in space. And it actually aged very well. Maybe it's because it's set in space and there's not a whole lot of references to anything that you can tie down in this world, but it aged really well. I was very surprised when I reread this about how well it aged. So that's just a little bit about why I think that Volume 1 of Alien Legion is a great run of comics. And I know I probably talked a little too long already. So I'll just say that if you like this description of Alien Legion, go out and buy it. Go out and buy one of the Omnibus. Go out and find back issues of this. That would be great. You probably is a good idea to go find back issues of this right now, because once they make this a movie and people actually get into Alien Legion, these back issues might actually be worth something. But that's just an aside. So if you liked anything here, if you want to hear more of this content, hit like, hit subscribe. And until I see you in the next video, make comics better by reading better comics. And this is a really good comic run. This is a better comic. All right. I'll see you later. Bye.